My good friend Roy gave me some pine boards, and after a while I decided to make a wall cabinet for my bathroom. These boards will make up the sides. I bought a small sheet of 1/4-inch plywood for the back. These boards will make up the horizontal shelves. This one's got a split in it, but we'll fix that. And I'll glue the smaller boards into panels for doors. And this last one will be the top. So I started by gluing and clamping the split board. I set it aside to dry. And then I ran the boards for the door panels over my jointer so that I'd have one perfectly flat side on each board to glue together. Here you can see that jointing the boards produces a glue joint with no gaps. So I glued them up, and I expertly clamped them. I have a real mishmash of clamps, but actually after I finished this project, my wife gave me several of the good Harbor Freight clamps for my birthday. She's pretty awesome. I set the door panels aside to dry, and I proceeded to work with the boards for the rest of the cabinet. I jointed one edge, and then I put that jointed edge against the fence of my table saw sled. I made a 90-degree cut on one end of the board to square it up. I flipped it around, and I cut it to final length. And then I put the jointed edge against my table saw fence, and I ripped the board to final width. Then I marked the vertical boards for a rabbet at the top and dados on the sides that will hold the horizontal shelves. My saw blades are all ATB, or alternating top bevel, blades, so the cuts I'm making here don't have perfectly flat bottoms. But I smoothed them out with a bit of sandpaper, and they were fine. My son and I spotted this little visitor in the sawdust on the garage floor. Using my router table, I routed a 1/4-inch groove that the plywood back would sit in. And here's where I made my only big error on this project. The groove wasn't supposed to go all the way from the top to the bottom of this board. It was supposed to stop at the bottom dado. And I realized my error right here. Oops. Here's what I should have done. Started the groove at the dado. And then I raised the router bit, and I made a second pass to make these grooves their full depth. I dry fit everything together at this point, and I found that it stood on its own with no glue or mechanical fasteners. And here's that extra groove that shouldn't be there. But I think we can fix that. I used my router table again to cut away some thickness on the edge of this board, and then I cut a narrow strip of that thin material on my table saw to make a patch for the groove. My first try was just a tiny bit too tight of a fit. And so I did a little sanding. And then it was perfect. So I added some glue, and then I added a couple of C-clamps to make sure the patch was seated in the bottom of the groove. I used a little flush trim saw to cut off the excess. And then I planed down the patch until it was flush with the surface of the board. I used a compass to draw a curve on the front edge of the two vertical boards. And I cut the curves with my jigsaw. I also drilled holes where the dowel will go, and that'll be a hand towel holder. I used my little disc sander to clean up the curves I cut with the jigsaw, and that worked well. And then I proceeded with the long and boring task of sanding off all that old finish that was already on these boards. And this took a while. Here I'm marking the dowel for its final length, and I cut it. I dry fit everything again, and then I added glue. I didn't have enough long clamps to glue all the shelves at the same time, so I only glued in the bottom shelf at this point, and I used one clamp on my top shelf to hold everything in place while the glue dried. The next day after work, I glued the top shelf and the middle shelf in place. I used clamps on the top shelf, and although I didn't get it on video, I set some heavy stuff right above the middle shelf to act as a clamp there, and that worked just fine. And then I started working on the doors. I jointed one edge, and I squared up the bottom. I measured the final height and width of the doors.
Your last meal. What do you want? His dad's office. Aziz says
the viewpoint of these academics and sociologists.
I ripped them both to final width, and then I stacked the doors and I cut them together to their final height to make sure they were exactly the same.
There's a link to some article about, a horse that found its owner somehow. It's not that interesting.
I used a belt sander to smooth out the glue joints in the door panels, and then I used a hand sander to remove the rest of the finish. Then I started marking for the door hinges, which had to be mortised into the door panels. I'm no expert with a chisel, as you will see, but I got the job done. I used a carving knife to mark the profile of the hinges, and I also used the knife to help clean up the mortises. Next time I would use a router. I think it rained for 4 or 5 days straight that week, and I got some really nice audio of a rainstorm as I was working in my garage one evening with the doors open. So I'll shut up and I'll let that play for a minute. It's really nice, particularly if you're wearing headphones. Okay, so it's the next day, and the sun is out, and I checked my progress. I installed the magnetic door latches.
This only takes maybe 15, 20 gigs to install, so you could probably move, but the rendering and everything else that you need for it is no capacity.
And it was time to cut the top to its final size. I used the same steps as before. I jointed one edge, and then I ripped and cross-cut it to its final size. And then I sanded off the old finish. And I glued and clamped it to the top of the cabinet. While the top was drying, I cut the French cleat that will hang this cabinet on the wall. I glued the French cleat to the back of the cabinet. Through this whole process, I tried not to get any glue onto the plywood back of this cabinet so that it would float inside that groove, but I'm sure that some probably did get on there at some point through squeeze out.
Generate a list, would have to know where it is in the list, would have to move the...
I started adding the first of 3 coats of satin polyurethane. Since this was going into a bathroom, I wanted to protect it as fully as I could against moisture and humidity. I used scrap blocks of wood with a screw driven through as stands so that I could finish both sides of the doors at the same time. After the first coat dries, it feels kind of rough where the finish raised the grain and also from any dust that might have settled. So in between each coat, I sanded with 220 grit sandpaper, and then I added the next coat. I used a handheld work light to help me see if I'd got an even coat. After the last coat, I buffed the surface lightly with 4/0 steel wool, and then I put on a coat of paste wax. After this dries for a bit, you just buff it back off. And after the cabinet was completely finished, I reattached the hardware. Then, all that was left to do was to attach the French cleat on the bathroom wall, and then drop the cabinet onto it. And right here is where my camera battery died. So flash forward to the next day, and here are some finished shots of the cabinet hanging on the wall with all our stuff added. I'm very happy with it. It was sorely needed in this tiny bathroom, which had very little storage. And it's very satisfying to use something every day that I made myself. Thanks for watching.